Good afternoon. We shall now discuss William Wordsworth's Ode on Intimations of Immortality. William Wordsworth's Ode on Intimations of Immortality is a long, irregular ode that has neither a fixed lyrical form nor the syllabic regularity of a blank verse, which is so uncharacteristic of Wordsworth. It rhymes in varying line lengths. This appears somewhat unsettling to us since we are used to seeing Wordsworth work either in blank verse or in fixed stanzas. The poem becomes all the more disorienting, as it were, as its opening stanzas develop a Wordsworthian crisis of faith that is particularly striking since this particular poem was published in the immediate aftermath of the 1807 context. After many charming lyrics about butterflies, various birds, rainbows, and even a playful kitten, in the collection of poems published in 1807, Wordsworth closes the book with this poem, the Intimations Ode, which starkly admits the things which I have seen, I now can see no more, and that there hath passed away a glory from the earth. The first section of the Intimations Ode concludes with despairing questions rather than the lyrical insights derived from nature we have come to expect. Wordsworth says, "Whither is fled the visionary gleam? Where is it now, the glory and the dream?" Wordsworth insists that he still hears, sees, and feels the joy all around him, but he laments the loss of precisely the kind of vision he seems to have gained from experiences described in such poems as, for example, Tintern Abbey or the Daffodil Poems. We expect the poem then to move toward a resolution of this crisis, and having studied the 1805 version of the prelude, which was written prior to this poem, we certainly expect that he will find recourse in a previous experience that will revivify his imagination. But instead, the poem becomes philosophical and significantly didactic. In other words, it does not sound to us at all like the Wordsworth of Tintern Abbey. Every reader of the poem has to account for the sense that it is ostensibly two poems. In fact, Wordsworth wrote the first four stanzas in 1802 as an attempt at a Pindaric ode in which the first two stanzas function as the strophe and antistrophe, and the longer final two stanzas as the epode. He returned to the poem and completed the rest of it in 1804. Even if we did not know these facts, we would discern nonetheless a shift between the first person I of the first four stanzas and the more universal, philosophical sounding first person plurals such as our, we, and third person subjects of most of the rest of the poem, that is, until the final stanza. The development of such a quintessential issue for Wordsworth as the visionary gleam perceived in the world around him seems very much unlike the Wordsworth that we had known till this time. What emerges in critical discussions is the awareness of not only two separately composed sections, but basically three thematic movements in the poem. The first four stanzas from 1802, that is lines 1 to 57, comprise the first movement of the poem. The rest of the poem, written in 1804, provides a response to the first movement. In the second movement of four stanzas, comprising lines 58 to 131, and a final third movement of three stanzas going from line 132 till the end of the poem. The second movement of the poem addresses the problem by suggesting that the visionary gleam has in fact not fled, but that we grow away from it in our progress from birth to death. These stanzas emphasize the visionary nature of children through their spiritual proximity to heaven, where the soul has pre-existence. At our birth, we come, as Wordsworth says, trailing clouds of glory from God who is our home. In the 5th, 6th, and 7th stanzas, Wordsworth explains that the child has some sense of the pre-existence, but through socialization and maturity, shades of prison house begin to close upon the growing boy, he says. Eventually, the adult loses the vision as it fades into the light of common day. The Intimations ode then engages themes that compare usefully with many of the poems of Blake's Songs of Innocence and of Experience. A definitive reading of the Intimations ode have generally remained elusive, but Lyland Trailing's interpretation comes very close to what an ordinary reader would take from this poem. He asserted that this poem is essentially a poem about growing up. And while Wordsworth's vision of adulthood is not as dark or grim as Blake's, coming from him it seems more depressing. A particularly troubling stanza, corresponding to the lines 77 to 84, presents a view of earth as a homely nurse that contrasts sharply with the usual way he presents nature in the Tintern Abbey. For instance, Wordsworth describes nature and the language of the sense as the nurse, the guide, the guardian of my heart and soul, of all my moral being. Here we might ask if this portrayal of Mother Nature represents the same force as, for example, the lines, "Earth fills her lap with pleasures of her own, yearning she hath in her own natural kind, and even with something of a mother's mind and no unworthy aim. The homely nurse doth all she can to make her foster child, her inmate man, forget the glories he hath known, and that imperial palace whence he came." These lines suggest complicity on nature's part in the socialization of the child, indeed, a mortification of the child, and the degradation of the child's visionary power as he grows up, adjusting himself to the society at large. Here, most uncharacteristically, he uses physical nature as a metaphor for mortality, devoid of the spiritual eminence so frequently celebrated in his other poems. The physical material world is associated with mortality and with something like philosophical necessity, and thus contributes to the diminution of the intimations of immortality the child enjoys. The next stanza in the poem, corresponding to lines 85 to 107, provides specific examples of the child's socialization through intimation and imitation of adult behavior and adult concerns and worries. This is how the child essentially learns to be an adult, as Wordsworth says, as if his whole vocation were endless imitation. And then the next stanza, corresponding to lines 108 to 131, seems to reverse the poem's progress to adulthood with a paean to childhood. So in what sense may the child be the best philosopher, as Wordsworth claims? The opening lines of the stanza recognize the paradox of proportion. The child's exterior semblance doth belie the soul's immensity. As the poem moves into its final movement, Wordsworth is called upon to provide some form of a happy ending, some sense of abundant recompense, as it were. The first four stanzas of the poem offer perspective unique to the poet, and its concern is rooted in a crisis of creativity and of imagination. The poem's second movement has universalized this concern, making it common to all human beings and also a matter of the soul. In the next long stanza, corresponding to lines 132 to 170, the poet claims to be grateful for the memory of having once been in touch with a sense of immortality. The poem does look forward to the realization of an immortal life beyond our noisy years, as he says, of mortal existence. The conclusion of this stanza reassures us that we can still access that feeling of transcendence when Wordsworth says, "Hence, in a season of calm weather, though inland far we be, our souls have sight of that immortal sea which brought us hither, can in a moment travel thither, and see the children sport upon the shore, and hear the mighty waters rolling evermore." While this may be a comforting assertion of immortality, these lines do not specifically resolve the crisis at the beginning of the poem. The peculiar difficulty of the Intimations ode is that Wordsworth turns to a resolution that stands counter to the thematic idea or notion of so many of his other works, particularly in the 1805 version of the Prelude. But it is also possible to appreciate this poem not as a carefully reasoned philosophical position. The poem ends with acceptance that the visionary gleam has been replaced with a sober coloring from an eye that had kept watch over man's mortality, and with the wonderfully enigmatic conclusion that, to quote, "To me the meanest flower that blows can give thoughts that do often lie too deep for tears." Perhaps we end the poem back on Wordsworth's familiar territory with a sense of the still sad music of humanity. So the image of the invisible power operating upon the flower and inspiring thought shows Wordsworth perhaps not only wholly committing to transcendence, but in fact committing to transcendence over immanence. Peter Manning, a critic of Wordsworth, suggests that the Intimations ode exploits the resonances of Christian faith without committing itself to belief, to the conviction that would lessen its human uncertainty. In other words, doubt is perhaps more true to human experience than certainty. Perhaps the whole poem is nothing more than lyrical speculation about what Wordsworth says, the faith that looks through death in years that bring the philosophic mind.